Hey there, everybody. This is a fan with too much time coming at you with an after talk. I know it's been a while, but there's a good reason for that. And I'll get into it. Today I'm going to talk about quite a few things relating to this series. But we're going to begin as canonically, or as in story mode as we can, and then gradually go down the line of topics. So one of the big things that I get from a few people is the question of an explanation for Ahsoka's abhuman status. And I've actually explained this pretty thoroughly in the comment sections, but I do keep getting the question, so I'll go ahead and do a full elucidation, at least as much as I can do, right here. So, Ahsoka's abhuman status. The biggest complaint I find about that is that a lot of people tell me that that Togrutas, which is Ahsoka's species, her race, that they're not classified as near humans in Star Wars. And I agree, they're not. Neither are several other extremely humanoid species. In fact, for a while, Twi'leks were not considered near human, despite always having had the capacity to literally interbreed with humans. So I'll go ahead and explain first why the near human designation for me is an extremely tertiary concern when I make this kind of judgment, and then I will explain the criteria that I use to try to more empirically judge this kind of thing, and where in the lore I source the potential and possibility for Ahsoka being a near human. So let's go ahead and start with that. Near human in Star Wars is supposed to denote a species that, as the name would suggest, is very near to humanity. And a lot of the times, this can seem extremely accurate. Zeltrons are near human. That makes sense. Chiss are near human. Makes perfect sense. In fact, the Chiss have a specified history that they were humans and simply changed to suit their environment over time. And, if you wanted to say that the near-human designation should only be used for beings that naturally evolved from humans to near-humans without any sort of genetic augmentation, then we could begin to approach a more understandable classification that would exclude beings like the Togruta. But the problem is that the near-human designation in Star Wars has been used by many authors in many settings, and it has been used extremely haphazardly at once to refer to aliens in their stories that are humanoid, and then at other times to refer to the latter explanation of humanoid beings that are supposed to be more human-like. And the way this reads in the lore is that the near-human designation is like a political designation. It's not an actual scientific designation. It should be a scientific designation, but when you have things like the Sulistans, species like the Loan, species like the Toffs, species like the Tong, the Shi'idu, for God's sakes, the Anzadi. When all of these species are included into the category of near-human, and they're designated as near-humans by the Republic, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It doesn't take a very long time at staring at almost any one of the named races to notice that they are distinctly really difficult to call human, not only because their appearances and morphologies are extremely different from baseline humanity, but because they often contain powers and internal abilities such as shape-shifting that would be extremely difficult to evolve on a human being. How many years of evolution would it take for us to evolve a baseline human into a shape-shifting abomination? Well, enter the Shi'idu. And it doesn't really make any sense. It's clear to me that the only reason the Shi'idu have the near-human designation in canon is a political reason. It's political. The Shi'i do benefit. Anyone who has the near-human designation benefits greatly under the Republic compared to not having it. And out of canon, it's because it simply hasn't been enforced, even in Disney canon, what near-human is supposed to precisely mean. You know, the Anzadi, they only look human because they prey on humans. But it's pretty clear the Anzadi are not humans. They're pretty different in a numerous amount of ways. For one thing, their digestive systems, what they eat, how they eat it, and also their super ambient force abilities. They're not very... That's not something that we normally give off to humans. Now, yeah, you have some species like the Maraluca, which tend to have innate force abilities, but you'll also notice that the Maraluca, aside from lacking eyes or functioning eyes, they're largely otherwise just human force sensitives. Not so with the Anzadi. It's pretty clear that their appearance is an evolutionary trait taken to get closer to their prey. In addition to that, we have species like the Nagai and the Toffs, both classified as near humans. Both come from outside of the Star Wars galaxy. They're extragalactic. So, I mean, what is a human in this case? What is it? I mean, it's one thing for humans to exist in the Star Wars galaxy and also in our galaxy. But what does it mean if they're just near humans in every galaxy? That doesn't... I mean, at that point, I don't understand how we can actually reconcile that with our understanding of, you know, evolution, genetics, just lines, blood lineages passing down. And yeah, sure, the Nagai look pretty human. Sure, they're just pale-skinned, black-haired space elves, basically. But the Toffs are giant green giants, you know, and they eat people. It's pretty crazy. The Tong, you know, the Tong may have evolved on the same planet as humanity, at least insofar as we understand it, but the Tongs are really clearly not a primate species. They're clearly not derived from the same humanity as, you know, if they were actually relatives of humanity, they should look a little bit more like us. They should internally be a little bit more similar. Instead, they're extremely distinctly reptilian. I mean, the reason that Mandalorian helmets are shaped the way they are is because of how bizarrely alien the head shape of the Tong is. So, for me, when I look at these things and I realize, okay, so we can accept all of these, even the Loan, as near humans. You know, you think that Togrutas and Twi'leks are far from near human. I mean, the Loan have more tendrils, fleshier heads, no noses really, except for like these two little holes, but no actual nose ridge. And they are very morphologically different, but they're near human, and a bunch of really near human looking species that behave extremely near human are not. So for me, the way that I reconcile that is that in the Republic, near human is a political designation. I think that makes perfect sense. I think that it helps to explain this very nicely, outside of going outside of the canon and just saying that, yeah, the near human attribution has just been literally randomly given out. And it's a spin of the dial as to whether or not it lands on you or not, because it's literally just up to any individual writer. And to give you a deeper example of that, you know, we have species that we don't even have names for who are considered near human. How does that make any sense? The city people are near human. The hill people are near human. The lurker people are near human. I mean, we don't even know what most of these people looked like. We don't at all. We have no actual knowledge of their extensive history. We don't know what's... You know, the lurkers all live inside of suits and are purposefully extremely difficult to get close to. And I could go on and on, you know. This is only a little spattering of the very bizarre attribution that has been given to the near-human designation. Some of them make perfect sense, like the Hapans, you know. Some of them make perfect sense, like the Umbarans. But some of them really, really, they do not. So, with that, I hope you understand why, for me, I can't take that as genetic gospel. There are just too many examples of near humans that aren't anywhere near human. And because of that, I don't feel bound by the Star Wars definition of near human when I'm actually determining what actually has a human lineage in Star Wars. But that isn't to say that I just give it out nilly-willy, or that I just look at what looks human and designate it as human. That isn't the case at all. I have a specific process that I use for determining whether or not I believe a species will be abhuman or near human when genetically scanned by the Imperium to see if they detect any human genomes, human chromosomes, human genetic material. And it goes something like this. I observe a list of human traits that I have. The first of these human traits that I try to determine here, and it's not just human traits, but I'll go into that. So the first one is, how mammalian does this being appear to be? You know, how primate, and more importantly, how mammalian? Because we end up getting a lot of reptile monkeys in a lot of science fiction. So, you know, I observe, okay, does this species appear to have, like, human-looking skin, even if colored or patterned? Do their bodies react thermally, you know, with the hot and cold in a similar way to how humans do? Do they need a special accommodation in one direction or the other? You know, how mammalian are they? And so I look at Togruta and the species Togrutas, and what I see is that their most non-mammalian features appear to be a general lack of hair, which is a little hard to verify given how, like, the animation on them is done, but I'll go ahead and say a general lack of hair, and that they have tentacles, you know, head tails. Now, I don't for one second believe that Twi'leks or Togrutas are cephalopods, and those are really the only creatures we have on the Earth that have tentacles. This is more just the case that, like, and they're not tentacles in the way that cephalopods have them. For Twi'leks, they're largely Twi'leks are terrible at war for this, but their brains sort of go into those tentacles, and then they're muscular. So there's a certain amount of the tentacle that's brain, and a certain amount of the tentacle that's muscle that allows them to move around, even though you don't see them really do it too much. And those features aside, both Twi'leks and Togrutas appear to be warm-blooded primate analogs that are extremely analogous to mammals. They give birth to live young. They have warm blood and are able to generate their own body heat. And this is verified in various forms of the media, both through heat fission being used to track several of these beings, but also just when you observe them entering cold environments. They don't need to wear specialized equipment. They don't have cold blood. So typically, they just appear very primate, and they pass that test. And you might say, oh, well, Ahsoka has, you know, and Togrutas have more than just tentacles. They have extendable fangs, which, yes, they do. But all things considered, that's not so hard to be evolved. That's not a distinctly non-primate feature. I can easily see if evolution were to desire it, that could very easily be a part of a mammal's biospec type. And not only that, but Togrutas have horns, but mammals have horns. That's not here nor there when it comes to that, because that's just a different mammalian feature. And again, like I was saying, you know, we have reptile monkeys, so while I do try to adhere to a primate baseline, it does get pulled around left and right, so I focus in on those mammal traits. And like I just described, to me, they seem pretty mammalian to me, just from my observations and my opinions here. Tentacles, head, tails aside. So then I go on to the next criteria, because that's enough for me from what I've seen. Definitely enough. I look at psychological profile, because it's not just enough to be a mammal or a mammalian analog to be human-like. You also have to be human-like. You have to think like a human, behave like a human. the farther you are from that, the farther you are from baseline humanity. And with Togrutas, more than almost any other of the Star Wars species, they are just extremely human. It's really difficult to actually like cement down how incredibly human they are compared to other aliens. You might say, "Oh, well, fan, you know, a lot of aliens are very human-like. That comes from being played by human actors and having human voice actors." And you have a point, but there is a little bit, there's more contextually in the universe that makes Togruta mentality very human-like, and it's variance. On the Togruta homeworld, you have a planet where the culture is largely tribalistic. The Togruta like to move around, they're roamers, they're nomadic, and they're hunters. And they have a very interesting, if a little skewed, morality system, where they're very communal and caring for each other. However, they don't believe in caring for each other's weaknesses, and when a Togruta grows very old, they will often just walk out into the forest to become a part of the cycle of life and simply die. And you might rightly point to that and say, well, if Togruta are like that in general, if that's like an instinctual behavior, that's not a very human-like behavior. You know, humans don't like to watch each other die, and we like to take care of our elders, and, you know, we have a general avoidance of that kind of community. It doesn't tend to propagate hugely across the world when it comes to human cultures. Not that it doesn't exist, just that it's not as propagated. Well, now let's look at the Togruta colonies. We have Togruta colonies that are, again, very communal, but who don't do that. In fact, on the Togruta homeworld, while they are omnivorous, they largely eat meat. And this may not surprise you, given that they have extendable jaws. Fangs. However, you know, it goes a little beyond that. They like to eat live prey. They still practice the act of bringing an animal live to the table and then killing it by sinking your teeth into it as you eat it, and that's a thing. It actually results in, because the Togruta aim, when they do this, they aim for the spinal column, and this causes the animal they're eating to have spasms, and this has led to a misconception that Togruta are venomous. They are not venomous. This is just from an aesthetic, but it's entirely untrue that they're venomous. You know, that's very, very ubiquitous on the Togruta homeworld. Togruta anywhere else don't do this. They many times find the practice pretty barbaric. They like to eat dead meat, like most of us. They don't like to take a living animal to their plate and then bite into it, regardless of whatever size this animal is. And they actually find their own extendable fangs to be pretty neglectable and unused. And sometimes they even lose the ability to extend these fangs from disuse because they simply have no innate need to use them. It's not a part of their mentality, it's just a physical ability that they have. And you look at the Togruta colonies, and they have extremely different cultures, where they look down upon the practice of abandoning the elderly. They don't believe in it. They have extremely close familial bonds. And then you have some Togruta that actually lean into the other direction, where they're much more warrior-like. My point is that in the few instances in which we've been able to see Togruta colonies, we don't just see expansions of an existing Togruta culture or empire, we see divisions in it. Divisions and varieties that are normally reserved only for humans in the setting. It's interesting because even the Twi'leks, who are even more widespread than the Togruta, tend to have a more ubiquitous culture, which is kind of odd, but there you have it. So for me, the variance that Togruta display in the societies they create is great evidence of a very human mentality. And that's before we begin to actually compare the Togrutas we know to humans and how they behave. And the way they behave is extremely human-like. Togrutas are actually favored servants among the Empire during the Empire era, specifically because they're easy to understand. They can be incorporated very easily. It's like having a human slave or a human servant without giving them the benefit of having the human designation, which seems very much like a thing the Empire would do and propagate. You also have to remember that Togruta The Togruta are very, very apolitical when it comes to the Republic. I don't believe there's a Togruta senator, and if there is, they don't really move or shake very much. More or less just trying to keep people and slavers out of their sectors, and not very effectively, I might add. So, for me, it just seems like the Togruta get shafted by the political system, but in general, there are just so many examples of them exhibiting extremely human behaviors and so few examples of them exhibiting alien behaviors. And, to take it over to the analog again, with the Twi'leks exhibit more non-human behaviors and tendencies than the Togruta do, largely in the form of their Leku language, their tail language, head-tail language, that is to say, which is not very well portrayed in a lot of the visual media, where you almost never see them actually move their head tails around. But in the written media and in a lot of comics, it's made very clear that they do, and that they can communicate with each other this way, and that Twi'leks can actually suffer certain social or mental deficits by failing to communicate with other Twi'leks in this way and not being communal with others of their kind. Togruta have no such issue. They don't have a problem. The Togruta head, tails, and horns, by the way, you might be wondering, what are those? They're sonic devices, basically. They're hearing devices. They're evolved in place of ears that allow them to hear really well. They basically have a form of echolocation that they use through their horns that give them a form of almost precognitive movement, even without the aid of the Force, just from how incredibly precise their ability to detect sound and sonic vibrations in the air around them is. This is even part of the reason why Ahsoka, at a very young age with relatively little training, is able to duck around, dodge, and block, and do all these crazy things with people, because she can use part of the Force to help her with that, and then she can actually just use her innate ability to hear things extremely keenly and locate them precisely to know when and where something is happening, even if she's not looking at it. But even that is not super overblown in her lore. But in general, the way that I see it, Togruta have an extremely, extremely human mentality. So then, I have one last big criteria that I usually need to fill out before I am willing to say that a mammalian, humanoid, human, psychologically seeming species is derived from humans. And the next is, okay, is there an in-canon suggestion or reason or pathway that is feasible that would explain the difference between the baseline humanity and this species and their new morphology? And in the case of the Togruta, there are two. First of all, the Togruta are within reach of the Republic, and their planet is not difficult to reach, which means that human sleeper ships could have very, 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 very easily reached Togruta Prime. Or I forget if that's the name of their homeworld. I think it is. But they could have very easily reached the Togruta homeworld without there needing to be any special explanation. It's just not that far away, and it's just not that hard to get to. In addition to that, we already know that several of these sleeper ships would attempt to augment or bring with them genetic equipment that would enable the humans that were on board that would arrive to augment themselves or their children to adapt to the local environment. Something they would need to do because in the era of sleeper ships, you're not going to get much support from your home empire, if any, ever at all. So you need to become self-sufficient, and you don't have a way of knowing for sure what the environment is going to be like when you arrive. There's an explanation right there. Sorry, losing my voice a little bit. There's an explanation right there. But there's another one too. Really early in the history of the Star Wars galaxy, the entire universe was dominated by a species known as the Rakata. And the Rakata were these crazy, amphibious, antenna-eyed monsters, basically, who were dark side users, and all of their abilities are based on the dark side. And they went around and enslaved tons. They enslaved everybody. Every species they'd come across, they'd basically enslave. With like the Sith being one of the few exceptions, because the Sith were actually able to fight them off at great losses to themselves. And this is also what propelled the Sith onto the path of the dark side. It's a very interesting story. Look up King Adis if you're interested. But the point is that the favored slave of the Rakata, the slaves that you saw propagated the most, given the highest positions and used in the most places, were humans. So the Rakata took humans with them everywhere, and they used them in every role. In addition to that, in the game Knights of the Old Republic, or rather Star Wars The Old Republic, the MMO that came after the Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2, there is a mission where you go to a facility, a location, where there is an AI, and this AI was created by the Rakata, and it's inside of this big genetics testing facility, and it explains to you, once you reach it, that its job was to take the human baseline, essentially, and adapt it to different tasks and different, things that the Rakata would need done, just turning humans into new species so that they wouldn't need to go and enslave another specific species to get a specific thing done. And it's implied that a lot of the common quote-unquote alien species that you encounter across the galaxy were created this way. And as it's speaking to you, it is actually using a hologram projection that is in the shape of a humanoid, and that humanoid is changing all the time, and it's going from species to species, and Togruta are part of the cycle of holograms it uses as it's talking to you. So while it doesn't actually tell you straight up that it made the Togrutas out of the human baseline species, it does heavily imply it by including the image of a Togruta in the many images it uses to represent itself. And so, to me, that sort of seals it in two different ways. Both in that the Togruta could have been part of the human sleeper ships, and that the Togruta could have been part of the Rakata genetic experiments that resulted in so many different kinds of human species existing within the Star Wars galaxy. And that more or less sums the big reasons why I classify Ahsoka and other beings that would fit these criteria as abhumans in the eyes of the Imperium. For them, it's not political, at least not yet. For them, it's just genetic scans. And can it detect human genomes? Can it detect, human genetic material inside of the being that it's scanning? And in the case of Ahsoka, it can. So, hopefully, even if you disagree with the general premise, you can understand my logic and why I swing in that direction, and why I'm not just favoring Ahsoka to give her a chance at peace, or, enabling her to have something she shouldn't have. I think that my criteria for this is rather logical, and I try to keep it logical. I do believe that I think it makes a lot of sense. That's what I mean to say. And with that, I'll go ahead and move on to the next topic of this After Talk. So, another question that I see coming up ever since the last episode, and I've tried to address it a few times, and even Old Man Reacts has actually read the comments and read the service record. But a lot of people seem to think that Farnes is more of a veteran. Farnes, who gave the speech to Ahsoka, that he's more of a veteran than he actually is. Farnes is, by the standards of the Imperial Guard, fairly green. Now, to be fair, a lot of people don't survive being green, but he is kind of in that category. I say this because Farnes has only been in a single combat engagement prior to the big jump. So the Battle of Axum is actually his second combat engagement. And the one he was in before was not actually that horrific or long-lasting. It took I want to say a little under a week for his regiment to secure total victory. And I'll go ahead and explain that in a second, but you might be saying, but Fan, he talks about all the things he's seen, and he's clearly seen some things from some pretty horrific Xenos. And yes, he has. I'll go ahead and explain that now. So, Farnes has been part of mostly recovery operations. And this is because of two things that ended up happening early in Farnes' career. And it's that the Vestillan Irregulars, the regiment that he's with, they arrived late, basically. They were called, in Farnes's very first deployment, they were called to repel an orc invasion from an agri-world. And they arrived late at that agri-world. And all they could do is see what was left behind. And I don't even mean that they arrived late and the orcs had already moved on, because as we know, with the way that orc spores work, you would still find some sort of orcoid life forms down there, unless you had arrived literally immediately after most, if not all, the orcs left. That's not exactly what happened. The battle went on, other forces answered the call, and the Vastillan Irregulars arrived too late to help in the fighting, so they served in recovery and reconstruction positions instead until they were reassigned to other battlefields. So Farnes was deployed there, and he spent about a week or two on that agri-world. Yeah, I'm going to say about 2 weeks on that agri-world, helping with recovery positions before they were called off to, another orc battlefront. And they arrived there, and again they arrived too late. A bit later, in fact, than they did in the previous instance. And that happens. Warp travel's a thing. Not only that, but there's internal corruption in the Imperium that sometimes prevents things from getting off as good as they should. So they arrived at a hive city that was named Celestine City. And there at Celestine City, Farnes saw, again, the aftermaths of an orc invasion, where the orcs had actually razed Celestine City prior to being driven off by the Skywatch, who arrived shortly afterwards, but not in time to save the city, by and large. There were plenty of survivors, but not nearly as many as should be from a hive city, and Farnes got to see firsthand why. And of course the reason why is because orcs like to smash, and they are not... Orcs are in no way kind to civilians. You'd think that they'd at least ignore them since they're not very fighty, but no, that is not how orcs deal with non-fighty things, as any Gretchen will tell you. They bully and beat them into oblivion. This is why the orcs do take slaves, but the slaves don't last very long. They chew through their slaves very, very quickly, because they just beat them to death, generally speaking. Orcs are extremely violent by supreme nature, and because of that, nothing that can't take orc beatings on a consistent basis can survive being around orcs for very long. So, those were two instances in which Farnes's the Vastillan Regulars arrived too late. In the next instance, the Farnes was technically in battle, but he didn't actually do any fighting. His ship did. So the ship that was carrying his regiment got into combat and was called into an interception of a bunch of shadow pirates, which are actually a part of a Drukhari warband. And while it was a little scary for Farnes to be in a ship that was in battle and he was kind of unable to do anything about it, he ultimately didn't do anything about it, and the battle ended. It ultimately ended once the Crimson Razors actually arrived, and the Crimson Razors executed some pretty clever maneuvers using aspects of their fleet tactics to board the Drukhari raiding vessels, and then once they actually got on board, the Crimson Razors ran through those raiding vessels and killed all the Drukhari pirates, and basically made them relatively safe to recover. So, since these were Drukhari slavers, and they had slaves on board the ships, and the Crimson Razors are not about to take a bunch of civilians onto their ships, especially since the Crimson Razors, more than most chapters, are constantly leaping from one engagement to the next in like a frenzied way, they left the recovery efforts to the Imperial Guard that were there. So Farnes boarded this Drukhari slaving vessel with the intention, or the mission rather, of recovering the slaves. And they did, and the slaves that were recently recovered were relatively unscarred. I mean, nobody gets captured by the Drukhari and doesn't get traumatized, even if it's like for fucking an hour. But, there were those who had only been there for a few days, and then there were those who had been there for a few months, and then there were the rest. And the rest included the humans that the Drukhari ate, and it also included the humans that the Drukhari tormented, and specifically turned into furniture, which, if you didn't know, Dark Eldar, aka the Drukhari, they do that. They turn you into living, moaning, eternally alive furniture, and they will actually extend your damned life for hundreds of years, for as long as they can, enjoying the fact that you have to live through that and become this thing that they literally sit or rest upon or even shit on. They're that kind of alien, and they're not very nice. And they actually look pretty human, though, referencing my earlier Criteria, the Drukhari and the Eldar in general would fail to pass the second test pretty spectacularly. Their mentality is extremely alien and extremely different. Even when I try to phrase them as being more sympathetic or similar to humans, they have to be very different because they just are. They're very alien. Excuse me. So, Farnes, he essentially, well, he saw the aftermath of what the Drukhari did to those people. And he was tasked with recovering those who could be recovered and giving the Emperor's mercy to those who could not. And he had to do that. And that was actually the first time that Farnes got to fire his weapon in the line of duty on the field, so to speak. And it was to kill the human survivors who were not really surviving, but rather being dragged through a living hell. So there you go. That's how he got those experiences. After that, Farnes was part of an assault on a discovered Rakghoul lunar outpost. But it was an outpost. When his regiment arrived, they didn't even have to wait for Space Marine support or any specialty units because they simply outnumbered and outgunned these previously hidden Rakghouls by so much that they were basically able to engage them safely at range and blow them away in the course of a week. And the week was just mostly like the fighting was largely done in the first 2 to 3 days of the actual arrival of the Astra Militarum, with the rest of the week spent cleaning up and mopping up what was there and scuttling the alien base, which, by the way, they didn't keep the Drukhari ships once they rescued the humans out of them. They scuttled them, naturally. So these are the things that Farnes has seen that lead him to believe that all of the imperial propaganda he's heard in his entire life and the religious propaganda, which is very much interwoven in the same thing, that it all must be real. That every horrific thing that the Imperium has told him about aliens must be real because he's frankly seen worse than what they typically tell them. So what his tirade was about was like 3 parts what he had seen and 1 part everything he's heard being validated by it. And that's why Farnes appears to have this impressive service record that's not actually that impressive. It's just in the line of duty as an Imperial Guardsman, even when you're doing things that are pretty boring, unless you're actually stationed to guard a place that isn't being attacked, you're going to see the works of the enemy in one way or another. And you know, it's funny because he actually hasn't seen very much of what heretics can do. As I've stated in previous videos, the Zektek sector is actually pretty unbothered by chaos by and large, especially, and when I say that, I mean especially Space Marine war bands. It's very hard for them to get into the Zektek sector, and there's not much there for them. This is actually part of the reason why the Skywatch, more the Skywatch than the Crimson Razors, because the Crimson Razors have taken exoduses outside of the Zektek sector for extended periods of time to join with other kinds of crusades, whereas the Skywatch has remained very much a local chapter. But the Skywatch in particular, while they're really good at fighting a ton of things, especially Eldar and other aliens, they actually lack in their capacity to fight against heretics, particularly Space Marine heretics, Space Marine traitors. They're not used to fighting other Space Marines, and they wouldn't do so well fighting other Space Marines if they had to, just because they are extremely unaccustomed to it. It's not a thing. Obviously they drill for it and they train for it, but they don't have a lot of history with it, and they don't have a lot of practical experience with it. So there you go, and that about explains Farnes' service record. So another big complaint that I get a lot, like a demoralizing amount, is that Axum is taking too long. And I feel you, because I never actually imagined that it would take this long. I have an outline for the entire plot. I just didn't... I'm terrible at measuring out how long different segments in the outline will actually take when I begin to flesh them out. And so Axum has... it has dragged on much longer than I had initially intended it to. And I'm sorry about that. I am. That isn't to say that, that isn't to mean or say that that everything that's happened so far hasn't been planned. It has been. Even our little chaos guy, that people aren't a big fan of, the heretic of the fivefold path. He was planned to be in there, and I gave him his own episode because he didn't really fit in with the others, and I didn't want to cram him into another chapter, but he's supposed to be there, and while he's not very influential for the Battle of Axum itself, he's extremely influential for the things that come after, and I've been suggested by several people that I should have never introduced him, or that if I was going to introduce him, I should have introduced him in a flashback later. And the problem with flashbacks is that I don't really like flashbacks. Too often it is the case that flashbacks are used in media in order to inject into history something that didn't exist there before. Now, not always, not always, but many times it is. And I'm not a very big fan of using flashbacks. I don't really like flashbacks. The timetable for everything is already kind of messy, in that it's hard to keep track because there's so many perspectives. So for me, adding flashbacks adds a complication I don't need, and it also introduces the element of doubt into the audience potentially as to whether or not this was always planned. Was he always supposed to be here? Am I adding something that is now being added versus was there organically and deserves to be there fully on its own merit? And it's important that people know that he was here and that he was part of this and that he was always supposed to be there, at least for me. But yeah, so I wanted to explain Axum's length a little bit because I was a little shocked myself by how long it's taking, but it makes sense in retrospect. And the reason it makes sense is because it's not like maybe I've made a mistake by numbering my episodes the way I do, but Axum is not one story. Although it is a bunch of intertwined stories, it is indeed many different stories. And I've seen people suggesting that 2 or 3 days have passed on Axum. That's not the case. Axum has been not going on for that long at all. The problem is, let's just say, for the sake of argument, this is not for the sake of canon, for the sake of argument, that Axum has taken 8 hours, okay? So that's 8 hours from Ahsoka's perspective. That's 8 hours from Anakin's perspective. That's 8 hours from Sando's perspective. That's 8 hours from Lazarus' perspective. That's 8 hours from Mace Windu's perspective. That's 8 hours from Aayla Secura's perspective. You see what I'm getting at. When you begin to add all these 8 hours together, you get well over 24 hours, which is what ends up feeling like why Axum is going for so long, because a lot of the things that are happening simultaneously. They're happening at the same time. And because of that, what's being depicted feels like it's taking really long. Another 8 hours for Farnes, another 8 hours for Samael, another 8 hours for Combier, things like that. Depending on how I've split up their viewpoints, you end up getting re-renditions of the same amount of time passing, which gives you the impression that a lot more time is passing than has not. Now, that's not to say that the Battle of Axum has not been taking a long time and that a lot of hours haven't passed, but it's not 2 days, it's not 3 days, it's not a week like some people have said. It really is that it's just been a continuous fight. This is part of the reason why Aayla is so exhausted, but why she's not done yet, because it's been essentially like a day, maybe less, maybe a little more, but it hasn't been more than that. It's just been very intense, continuous fighting, and you've been getting tons and tons of perspectives from it. And if I were to actually cut these perspectives up, which may not work super well because they're also very intertwined, but if I were to cut them up, you would realize that I've been writing 3, 4, maybe 5 books at the same time. Just in the amount of people that are involved over this one event. And I don't feel sorry about that because it's doing justice to each of their viewpoints, in my opinion. But I am sorry that I didn't foresee the effect that would have and warn you guys adequately about it. And no, you actually, I'll say this. It's going to be very rare that all of the main characters, it really is like all of them, with like the exception of Caiaphas Cain and Boba Fett and stuff like that, and General Grievous, which also they've been included into the narrative, which extends the time. But that aside, aside from that, it's going to be extremely rare for you to actually see this many viewpoint characters all in one place. That's part of what's made, it's actually the predominant reason as to what's made Axum take so incredibly long. It's been like 4, 5, 6 books of character point of view, all concentrated into one narrative. It's part of the reason why I chop things up, and it's part of the reason why people complain that, oh, I really liked this part, and now I'm going to this part, and I'm not so psyched about this part, but now I'm going back to this part. And it's like, yeah, it's because I'm chopping it up because it's so many different character viewpoints. And maybe I made a mistake in doing that, I don't know. It's sort of the way that George R. R. Martin does it, and he has a very similar thing. But even for George R. R. Martin, it's rare that so many of his characters are actually in the same city in the same battle. It does happen sometimes, and then you see a very similar effect, but not as often. So that is part of what's exacerbating the length of Axum, is that I have almost every main character in the entire universe here. And that's me cutting things. I've already been cutting things. There was supposed to be a lot more of Palpatine and what he's doing, because he's in the fleet battle. He's actually aboard his own custom Star Destroyer in the fleet battle that you're seeing. And he's actually he's supposed to be performing some battle meditation. I had an entire chapter written out for him, but after I got a lot of flack for the Plo Koon bit, and I got a lot of flack for a lot of flack for the naval fighting bits, from people. I decided to go ahead and cut back on that for the sake of the audience, because people didn't seem to be enjoying it. And I'm here to write an enjoyable story. I said it at the very beginning of everything, that it's a good story, and a good story has to be enjoyable. It can't, or appreciable. It can't be bad. So I don't want to let the audience necessarily dictate everything that I do. But that doesn't mean that I don't listen to you guys, and I'm not affected by what is said to me en masse. And I'll say this: you may not see as much criticism in the comment sections as you expect. That's because all the criticisms that I get, where people curse at me, occasionally imply death threats, which whatever, man. When people are really, really nasty, and you can actually see some examples, because I try not to. I try really, really hard not to ban anyone, not to remove comments. And I try really hard, and I give people multiple chances to be civil. But a lot of people aren't civil. They are not. And I remove those comments because I don't want to endorse or encourage that kind of discourse, especially towards me, because it hurts my feelings, makes me feel bad, ruins my day, leaves me feeling weak and unwilling to continue. And I have to discourage that even within myself. So if you don't see as much as you might think should be there, know that I've already removed all of the worst ones, the ones that are voiced most uncivilly or with a lot of vulgarity or just inappropriate behavior. My whole point is just that there's a reason why the length of Axum is so long, and it's because there are so many main characters here, just so many of them. And I had planned to go back to Anakin for a minute now, but people don't like me to split up so much. So I'm gonna go ahead and take care of Axum as much as I can before Anakin necessarily or unnecessarily or whatever may happen gets involved directly with it, if he even does. And before I go back to Anakin to go ahead and show you what's going on with him, which is, you guys, I think you're gonna like it. I hope you like it. But my whole point is just that's why you haven't really seen Anakin. I'm trying to nail down Axum. There's some people who complain that the knight, that I built up the knight for so much, but then it was just destroyed. And the knight saved the saved Ishtara Ordain. Without the knight being there, Ishtara Ordain would be killed. Without the knight being there, Farnes and Ahsoka would never have met. Nerva would never have been recovered by the Republic. And, in addition to that, I was sort of showing that Nerva is this, she's a princeps. And to show that, I didn't want to make it a small deal. I wanted it to be a big deal. And we don't really get a lot of views in canon about what it's like for the Mechanicus to interface with things like Titans and Knights and things like that. So I wanted to make that elucidating and entertaining and to give you a close-up view of what that process is like and what it's like when something is done recklessly and wrong, but by a will that is so enormous it cannot be suborned, which is what was happening with Nerva and the AI and the ghost pilots and whatnot. And I see that wasn't by and large, that wasn't appreciated by the audience, which I learned a lot of lessons from. I definitely will adjust my writing style for that. But that was the reason why I did that. And it's not to say that that the knight wasn't incredibly influential in the battle. And you saw that for the brief period of time, relatively brief, that the knight was involved in the battle, that she did do a lot, and she did raise morale, and she did help fight everything and push back the Republic advance. But when it came down to, because she was supposed to have another battle scene before the ship came down, but people were already really complaining about the length of things. And ultimately, what would there have, I showed what she was doing. I showed the effect that the night weaponry had on these Juggernaut tanks. And any more that I would have added would have just been fight scene. Fight scene that you can imply would be there. You can imply that she's doing these things. It wouldn't have actually shown you anything new. And a lot of people are telling me to cut down the fight scenes and to not show us things that are assumed already and to skip past those things. And so I thought I was doing well by that advice when I decided to cut out the extra battle scene for the night, only for that to be revealed to be a very unpopular move on my part, which I'm sorry about. I try to do my best, I do. It's hard to predict sometimes what will be hit and what will be missed, and I'm just trying to adhere as much to the points on my diagram here without compromising too much. But already I've cut a lot to try to save time, and I thought that would be a safe thing to cut, and it was not. And I'm sorry about that. But in any case, without going on too much about that, the whole point is just that Axum has a ton of point of view characters, and I wanted to show everybody that. And as for Sando, a lot of people are not big fans of Sando. Sando is the clone perspective. He showed us what was happening with Delta Squad. He gave you a close-up of what it was like for the clones to be fighting against the Sororitas and against the Imperial soldiers in general. And he also showed you what the lethal edge of the clones is like. I couldn't really do that with Rex. He wasn't in a position to do it. And I felt that I owed it. My whole, one of the big things I do here is I try to be fair to both sides, and I try to show the encounters for both sides and the reactions for both sides. A lot of people say that a huge part of what they enjoy about the series is the reactions both sides have to each other. And Sando was a huge part of that, and the things that he observed were a huge part of that. But it wasn't. But Sando also was not super well beloved by the fans. So you'll notice that he gets much less screen time now, and that's fine. Sando can go ahead and sit in the back now. But in any case, this is why Axum is taking so long. Tons of point of view characters. I'll try not to add any more. I don't think. I'm looking at my diagram here, and I don't think I'm adding any more. In fact, I think that some will begin to fall away pretty soon. But that is more or less what was going on insofar as that. And I hope that this explanation makes sense to you and explains why so much time seems to have passed, even if that much time hasn't passed, and why it's taken kind of close to 3 years for me to get this far in the Axum saga. And part of it too is that that I don't really get paid to do this. I have some Patreons who very generously help me out and help feed me for the work that I do. But there aren't too many of them. And if you want to join, if you want to be a Patreon and help me out with my expenses and with getting my work done in general, then the link is in the description of every single one of the videos that I release. So you can always go down there and donate $1 or $2 to me if you feel like I've deserved it. But aside from that, it's just that I have to break from it to do normal work. I have to get other things done, and I have aspirations of my own. I have original series and original comics of my own that I want to be successful. So while I definitely do want to finish this, sometimes I feel like I'm being forced to choose between working on Star Wars versus Warhammer 40K and literally anything else that might profit my life or benefit my own original works, and sometimes I just can't do that. I've already basically had to stop the. I mean, I'm not going to stop it forever, but I've put on pause, on hiatus, the Darkness and Light series, in part because so few people seem interested in it, and I don't want to lose your attention. I worked very hard for that attention. I just wish I could get a little humoring for the other projects around, but even the Eldar story has relatively little engagement, so I don't pursue those things as much. And I'm going to go ahead and just try to get through the end of Axum before I move on to another project. But yeah, that's my whole complex going on with that. That's where my mind is with that. And part of the reason that Axum has taken so long is because sometimes I just need to take a break and do other things that benefit me. And I'll say this: I think I can type a lot. I think I'm a pretty fast, hardcore typer. And given the amount of effort that goes into every one of these episodes, and I'm still able to keep the rest of my life in order, I think I do a pretty good job. But I can't do a much better job than what I'm doing without losing everything that I have. So I have to ask for your patience in that. I see some people complaining about the breaks that I take and the time between releases, and I wish I could do better, but it's not physically possible, and not at this stage. So that's where we're at with that. In any case, I think that wraps up the talk about the length for Axum, and now on to a different topic that people have been asking me a lot about and criticizing me about. So I'm also sometimes getting a lot of questions about the Q&As. Why no more Q&As? Where's my Q&As? I want my Q&As. And why did you stop doing them? And the reason is because a lot of the questions that can be asked have already been asked. And a lot of the questions that are being asked they necessitate spoilers. And I don't like turning any of you guys down, and I don't like engaging in that way. But it gets to the point where it's like, even answering one way or the other with a question gives spoilers. Like, even talking about it, addressing it at all, implies things and tells you things that I don't want you to know yet, that the narrative wants to take its time with and have be a surprise. And it gets undercut with a lot of the Q&A questions that I get. So when it comes to questions as to, why no more Q&As? What about the Q&As? I want Q&As. I hear you. I really do. And I wish that I could answer all your questions without spoiling everything for you. But some of you have some really good questions. Some of you have some really basic questions. And both can definitely run face first into the wall of the plot. And I don't want... I really don't want to spoil things, and I don't want to do that. So Q&As I may answer very rarely in text form in the comment sections. But you have to be careful about what you're asking me, because if you're asking me things that you know are going to be spoilers, what happens to Farnus? I mean, you got to wait to see that, man. What? I don't want to have to answer you just to tell you that. That doesn't make, it doesn't make anybody happy. So now I'm more or less ignoring the Q&As in the comment sections and in everywhere else until unless I see Q&As that can be answered, and then I'll probably deal with them individually in a text format, because there just aren't enough of them to put into there just aren't enough of them anymore to put into the videos themselves. So that's why no more Q&As. It's run its course for the most part. We gotta wait for more of the story to come out. We gotta wait for Axum to end, because a lot of these Q&As are now getting very general or too specific, and either way, they are necessitating spoilers, which I don't want anyone to get. So no spoilers for you, and therefore no more Q&As on the videos for the time being. And that's, I think that's more or less what people have been criticizing me for. I hope I have answered to your satisfaction some of those criticisms and helped you come to understand what happens on this side to cause those things to happen. I apologize for any lag or dragging that you feel the story may be going through. I am doing my best, and maybe I'll go through and edit my videos and chop them up a bit to try to alleviate that problem. But you know, going forward, I'm going to go ahead and just try to cut down. I'm going to go ahead and just try to bring this to a close. I see a lot of people. I mean, geez, you guys wouldn't believe some of the cursing that I get. And then followed by unsubscriptions, which, you know, it's a little disheartening. I don't want to sound pompous or anything. You know, I've been doing this now for about 3 years, and I thought I'd hit a higher subscriber point by now. I thought I'd have a few more of you guys with me to follow me on this journey by now. Not to say that's a reason to stop or anything. I had just thought that the writing would be a bigger hit, which, you know, presumption on my part, pure presumption. But it does, you know, I can't help but be a little disheartened by it sometimes. So yeah, whenever somebody yells at me and I see the subscriber count drop, it definitely hits me. You know, I recently had somebody disagree with me very loudly over my position on Russia and Ukraine and how I shouldn't be discriminating and all these things, and just throwing a lot of things in my face and telling me that they're going to report all my videos, which luckily that resolved, and the individual user cooled off and decided not to go that route, which I appreciate. But you know, I'm a bit of a shy person, and that kind of interaction drains me a lot. You know, it's hard for me to describe, and you know, I'm just a human. You know, I'm just a person. So even if it's not most people, when 100 people, you know, which is a fraction of the amount of people who actually watch these, even on day one, but when 100 people hit me with nasty words or hard criticism, man, I'm just a guy. I'm just one guy. That many voices on a person like me, it crushes me, man. Sometimes it just crushes me. I ask that if you have a criticism for me, that if you need to voice it, you know, just voice it kindly, civilly. You know, please don't impugn the quality of the work. Not if it doesn't need to be that way, because I get some people saying some really horrific things and then following it up by saying, "Oh, but I really like your work." And it's like, man, Jesus Christ, man. I mean, I wouldn't get that impression from the tirade I just got from you in the front of all this, you know. And some people are better at it than others, and I engage with the people who are better at it than I do with the others. But remember, you know, part of the reason why people can be canceled without even the majority of the population being against them is because everybody is just one person. Everybody is just one human social creature. And unless you're like a sociopath or a psychopath like fucking Logan Paul, you know, you can't really ignore it. It gets you. You know, we have a tribalistic, ingrained lizard brain need to not be the recipients of a ton of negativity and criticism from so many individual humans. Because remember, your brain doesn't understand percentages. We had to invent the concept of percentages to apply to in a logical construct to the real world. Your brain just understands number of people. So I get a lot more compliments than I get criticisms. But when I get hundreds of criticisms, it doesn't matter. You know, to my brain, to the knee-jerk physiological reaction that the human mind has to that, it just feels bad. It feels bad. ruins my day, you know. So please voice your criticism civilly, you know. Please don't impugn the quality of the work, you know. Be tactful with what you say. And you know, the worst ones are the ones that are voiced that have a point, but that are voiced mean. Like, you know, I have people telling me about how the work should be more, that they can see why the work isn't more popular, why the things I do aren't more popular, and it's because of this, and this. And I'm like, I get it, you know. It could be more popular. I feel that lack too, and I want to do better, but maybe cushion the blow a little bit, you know that I'm getting a bunch, you know. Somebody nudges you on the arm, it doesn't hurt very much, but when 100 people nudge you on the arm, suddenly your arm gets sore. Please, you know, keep that in mind. And I'll say this, there are times when I can take it better and other times when I can't take it so well. Like, for example, right now I'm not in a very strong state, and part of the reason isn't just because of the frequency. I mean, the last like 3 or 4 releases have been just filled with criticism. But that aside, and entirely unrelated to that, I've also been feeling a lot of fiction fatigue. Not from my own fiction, but because, you know, the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power came out, and the MCU has just been so disappointing, and Star Wars, I haven't been able to watch Star Wars ever since the Book of Boba Fett. I feel like parts of me have been killed. You know, not to be too melodramatic about it, but as a writer, I live inside of these stories. They are my sanctuary. They are my craft. And you know, with the Lord of the Rings especially, you know, my father used to read me the Lord of the Rings as a kid. It was a thing that introduced me to fiction and bred in me a love of fiction. And to watch it being so abused by people who just should know better, they should know better. I can't, I'm trying not to, I don't want to let this get to me. But, you know, Galadriel, what they did to her, the Númenóreans, what they did to them, and then, you know, there are things like She-Hulk, things like Thor: Love and Thunder, and then the little things that are interspersed into almost all the other properties. And then the Book of Boba Fett and the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, which I haven't watched very much of, just clips, but the clips have been so horrific. I mean, everything but the final confrontation between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker. It's just so ill thought out, very little care taken, and oftentimes directed or produced by the people I thought I could respect in this, you know. Dave Filoni was a producer for the Book of Boba Fett. How could he let that happen? How could he? You know, these are stories that are so near and dear to me, and I'm watching them and living through at this current time, living through a time where they're being butchered. And what's more, they're being butchered oftentimes, not every time, but oftentimes by people who hold a political ideology that I agree with, and they're butchering both. I mean, it's like the elves are going to take our trade. The elves are going to take our jobs. You know, like one elf, Galadriel, lands on Númenor, and suddenly there is rhetoric about the elves replacing the Númenóreans, when there's just one elf in all of Númenor right now, and she wants to leave. She wants to leave. Oh man, it's so careless. Doesn't love the story, doesn't love the world, doesn't care. Cares more about what's happening here in our world than what is happening there in their world. And that's not what you do with a story. And it's so disheartening, you know. And, you know, I often ego trip a little bit and think, oh, I can write these stories better than them. And maybe I can't, you know. I get my fair amount of criticism too. So maybe I'm not all I'm cracked up to be. But it just feels like even if not me, there should be better writers for these things. You know, there should be better writers that just, you know, you can put your political ideology into a work. You can. Just do it with some nuance. Do it with some subtlety. Do it with some love for the world that you're talking about and putting it into. But there just doesn't seem to be any of that anymore. And I feel like, I don't know, like parts of my life die every time this happens. And I want to watch Andor, but I can't bring myself to do it, even though I know it's good. Too much of me that loved Star Wars has been abused and just taken advantage of by the Disney corporate structure and their ridiculous ideology of making the things the way they do. And it just hurts me. And I am in the middle of that weakness. The whole reason I bring this up is just to tell you that I'm in the middle of that. That's happening to me while everything else is happening to me. And sometimes I just feel like I should just let it all go. Let go of Star Wars. Even let go of Warhammer. Just let it go and do my own thing and just unabashedly do my own thing. And let those things die. Like, straight up take Kylo Ren's advice and let them die. You know, he's like, let it die. Kill it if you have to. And it's like, I don't even have to kill it. I'm watching other people kill it. I'm watching other people murder the love of my craft. And it's just a lot weighing down at me at the same time. I'm glad that I finally moved because it has really helped me stabilize and get to a place where I'm trying to get to. But, you know, moving to a place can only do so much. I'm a writer, and I live in a world where all of my favorite properties and legacy characters are being written by people who just don't care about the story or the characters, don't love them. You know, I mean, even Chris Hemsworth, who plays Thor, is straight up saying that he's not going to come back to Thor if he has to work with Taika Waititi again because of what Taika Waititi did to him, you know, sexually objectified him, abused of his character, degraded Thor down to a complete and total buffoon. And that's not right. People shouldn't be allowed to do that, you know. It's crazy because it just feels like all of these things are in the hands of these mindless capitalists who are then in turn handing it off to people who hate the work, who hate it, who hate the Lord of the Rings, who hate Star Wars, and then they destroy it. And just some of us like me, that's like a part of my soul, part of who makes me, a part of my identity of who I am being put into the ground. And sometimes I feel like the only way to rebuild is just to let it all go, which is not something you want to hear from the guy writing the Star Wars versus Warhammer 40k fan fiction. You know, it's not something that I want to feel. I wanted to be more hyped than ever. You know, I remember the early days of things. I remember when Bad Batch first came out. And I saw not Bad Batch. I remember when season 8 of the Clone Wars came out. And yeah, you know, some of Ahsoka's parts were weak because she was with these characters that were really annoying or unnecessary, just, you know, whatever. But the parts with Mandalore, and then when we discovered what happened to Echo is a servitor. I freaked the fuck out about that. You know, look at the armor that the Bad Batch is wearing. It has skulls and shit on it. It's just so cool. It's so Imperial adjacent, and I loved the shit out of that stuff. And I remember being so excited. I remember watching Rogue One and loving almost every instance of it. I remember watching Solo and still liking the shit, loving the fuck out of it. Even the SJW droid, which I think works. It's not an example of an injection of politics where it doesn't belong. That shit can be 100% canon. That shit can be it makes 100% sense why that would happen. And they played it for a joke, so people need to chill the fuck out about the SJW droid. And this is coming from a guy who vehemently hates SJWs. But then it all just continued sloping down, and you know, we get little islands like the Mandalorian, but the good the Mandalorian does is not as good as the bad that the Book of Boba Fett does, and the bad that the Obi-Wan Kenobi show does. Those things, taking legacy characters, butchering them in front of us, is like watching a family member being executed every fucking day. And I really can't handle it, you know? I can't handle it. I can't. And I have so much more to say about that, but I'll leave it there because I don't want to fill up the entire time just talking about that. But the only reason I bring it up is because that weighs on me. It weighs on me in a way you can't imagine. Or maybe you can, but if you do, I expect you have sympathy. And it's just happening all at the same time, you know? At the same time, you know, I get these bouts of uncertainty, of extreme uncertainty. You know, am I good enough to do this? Am I carrying through the way I should? Should I just stop or change my plan, rewrite this, rewrite that? And, you know, I'm trying to keep it on a schedule, which means that there's a deadline for me to decide a lot of these things. And that deadline only leaves me feeling more unsure. Fuck, the deadline passed. Fuck, I've released this. And is it any good? Is it any bad? Did I do right? Did I do wrong? Whatever the case may be, I can't take it back anymore. It just leaves me feeling with this great amount of uncertainty that is on top of everything else. And it can just make it hard sometimes, just really hard to keep going with this. And not to put too fine a point on it, it wouldn't be the same if I was doing this for a job, because at the end of the day I could look back at what I've done and think I've profited from this. But you know, I've barely broken even on the art. Really, I have. I love my Patreon supporters, but there's like a handful of them, and they can't support everything that I do. And I'm extremely grateful, because at the very least it means that I can make a little bit more art now, but not like I used to when I had saved up for a few years. I'm sorry for rambling. I just feel sometimes this crippling uncertainty, and I can usually push entirely past it. I can dominate it. I can completely control it. But so many of my pillars have been drilled into in recent years that it's become harder and harder, is what I mean to say. And, you know, some people think that I should be working with, like, oh, why don't you contact 40K Theories? Why don't you contact Major Kill or Voldemort? And I want to. I want to. But look at my channel. You know, I'm barely over 8,000 subs. And look at their channels. They're gigantic. You know, they're the kings of this half of the YouTube industry, you know. They're the lords, and I'm a peasant. I'm just not confident enough to go before them and ask anything. I don't even know what I would ask, you know, like do they want to voice something, or do they want me to work a little with them? I wouldn't mind, you know, if Major Kill or Voldemort wanted me to ghost write some things for them, and get some credit maybe in their videos. That would be absolutely incredible, but I just don't have that kind of confidence, not when I'm so low on the scale, so light on the scale, so low on the ladder. I wanted to contact them once I had at least 10,000 subscribers, you know, and be like, hey, I'm a tiny channel, but I think I can do some good things and maybe collaborate with you. But I don't even know if what I'm doing is that impressive. You know, it's important not to get locked in your own head. It's important not to believe your own hype or to breathe in your own dust. And at the end of the day, what am I? I'm a glorified fan fiction writer. You know, that's part of the reason why sometimes I feel like I just need to stop everything and just focus on my original works, because if I don't, then will I ever be more? Will I ever be more than a glorified fan fiction writer? What does that lead to? What will people remember me for? Being the guy who wrote a fan fiction. And that doesn't feel good. You know, I want my own projects to succeed, but sometimes, not even sometimes, most of the time, I just put more effort into this when it comes to the free time that I have to spend. And maybe that has to change, you know. Maybe I should go back to Darkness and Light more. Do my original works more. I just don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose this audience. I've worked for 3 years to gain these 8,000 subscribers, to gain your eyes on this video, if you're even one of the people who's going to watch the after talk and even get this far down. And it's scary for me to think about switching gears and doing something else. I tried to do a few reaction videos, and the reaction videos got a horrible reception. I got people cursing me out for doing that. People freaked out that I was going to stop doing Star Wars vs. Warhammer 40K. And in general, they just have terrible view counts. And let me tell you something. YouTube is not my friend. I joke about it and how, my videos get stopped sometimes. But, for example, in this last video on literally the last video just before this one with Farnes's speech, it was my number one video. Out of the last 10 videos I was doing, was the number one, and then suddenly YouTube took away half my views and destroyed the visibility of it. And I didn't get a copyright strike or anything. I don't know what happened, but I guess that a lot of people were watching Farnes's speech over and over again, and YouTube decided that must be bots and removed all those views and took away my larger visibility. And I watched everything that I had worked for there for that video, that boost that I'm expecting after I get, a new video out. I just watched it die before Monday was done. And that is crippling to me sometimes, feeling like the system I'm working on and sometimes working for is so biased against me and has so little faith that I can do anything. That if my video does particularly well, it must be bots, and then chops it down. And listen, I do not use bots. I can fucking afford to even. And I don't know. I just, it doesn't defeat me, but it weakens me. It's blow after blow with that kind of thing. So I want to work with these bigger creators, but I also want to get to a size that is at least somewhat respectable before I do that, because otherwise I don't even know what I could offer them. And again, I'm basically just a glorified fan fiction writer. What could I really offer channels that big and that successful? Again, sometimes I feel like I should just work on my original content, but I'm just so afraid of having done all of this for nothing. And of course, obviously, I want to finish. I didn't begin this journey. I didn't start writing this with 0 subscribers because I didn't have an innate, powerful impetus to get this done. It's just that sometimes, day by day, it feels like there's less and less of a reason to. And I don't know. I'm sorry to put all of this on you. Honestly, half of this is just a vent. Just to tell somebody how this feels. Just to tell somebody what I feel like. But in any case, I've definitely eaten enough of your time by now. I'll go ahead and put this down here and say, have a great weekend. Have a great day. Go visit the people you love. Remember what's really important. Don't let things get you down. And until next time, I'll see you with the next episode. Goodbye.